Please take your seat as we are going to start right now.
Thank you.
We can start on tour.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Renda Slim, and I'm the director of the program on conflict resolution at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins University SAIS, Foreign Policy Institute. I welcome you all, and thank you for being here with us. The topic of this panel is bringing multilateralism back, renewed ambitions for conflict resolution. As we all know that multilateralism has been one of the key pillars of the global institutional architecture since the end of World War II, and has played a central role in the promotion and sustainment of peace and prosperity worldwide for over 70 years. Nonetheless, in recent years, the prospects of multilateralism have become more fragile, whereas the legitimacy and efficacy of multilateral solutions have been questioned and challenged. Cooperation in the fight against the pandemic has reversed this trend only partially. Against this backdrop, some positive signs of the capacity of the international community to ease political tensions and prevent violent conflicts in the broader Mediterranean have emerged recently. This has provided hopes about a resumption of the fundamental role of multilateral institutions in conflict resolution efforts and in implementing shared, equitable, and effective solutions towards peace and stability. The region is facing challenges such as protracted conflicts, international disputes and rivalry on its territory, sectarian divides, human rights violations, all of which underline the urgent need of building a new approach to international governance and rules-based international cooperation. And to address this very important topic, we have today with us an excellent panel of practitioners, of diplomats, people who have had, professionals who have had long-term experience with international institutions in different settings, have been involved as negotiators, mediators in many of these protracted conflicts that the region is still suffering from, and will have, in my opinion, a lot to share with us in terms both of their experience and their reflection on what needs to be done to go forward to revive this multilateral approach to deal with conflicts and to deal with the problems of our times. So let me introduce the panel first. To my left, we have Mr. Cornel Ferruta, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong.
That's correct.
He is State Secretary for Global Affairs and Diplomatic Strategy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Romania. And virtually, to my left, Mr. Niels Annen, Minister of State in the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. Then virtually to my right is Mr. Khalid Khiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific at the United Nations. And far right is Mr. Stefan de Mistura, Secretary General's personal envoy for Western Sahara at the United Nations. And next to me, to my right, is Mr. Sven Koopmans. He's a special representative for the Middle East peace process at the European Union. So welcome, and we are looking forward to a nice and interactive discussion as much as possible. So I'm going to start with Mr. Feruta, please, with a question in terms of what's your perspective on how multilateral institutions should be reformed and relaunched in the post-COVID pandemic season? And you have a total of 5 minutes. Each one of you have a total 5 minutes in the first round.
Less than 5 minutes, I'll try to make it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. First of all, while I'm humbly sitting here, I think it's quite challenging for me in this panel to reflect on multilateralism in general, especially with Ambassador Mistura sharing the podium and with such distinguished panelists which have a long-standing experience in multilateralism. But I think it's a very fitting conversation. I have to applaud the organizers for setting the scene in such a way and capturing the very essence of the current debate on multilateralism and the shifting winds on multilateralism. I think many may consider that multilateralism is old-fashioned. Some may believe that we took multilateralism for granted and we became complacent. It may be true. And I think at some point we have to look at the pandemic not only as an inflection point, but also an inspiration point. I think it can show what we can do, what we cannot do, how we should do it, and how we shouldn't do it. And in order to do that, I think it's important to address the key lessons learned from the pandemic, which is not over, but I think we have a quite clear view. From my point of view, I think the Romanian perspective is very clear. There could be no foreign policy objectives, and I'm here talking about individual and projecting our values towards global without multilateral values at the core, without defending the principles and the norms that we have developed, without protecting the multilateral rules-based international system. And I think it became, for many, quite a slogan lately, but I think we have to go back to what exactly this multilateral rules-based international system is about. It's exactly the projection after the Second World War of the international community to try to avoid another conflagration of this nature, to avoid chaos. So trying to define or redefine, to interpret the rules-based international order, I think would not lead us anywhere, will backlash, and definitely we will not help us addressing existing crises or solving conflicts. From this point of view, again, the motto of the MED 2021 conference, leveraging transitions. This is part of the transition, and Minister Di Maio talked about 3 transitions. And I think this is one of the key transitions in the international community. How we transition from a complacent approach to a more proactive, because dismantling the status quo is doable, is feasible, and I think is within reach. We have the elements there. And I'm saying this also through also looking at the lessons we have learned from the past. Now, the pandemic. One of the key lessons is that unilateral efforts are rarely successful. And when they are, they have a limited impact. We cannot address a particular crisis, and the pandemic is a case in point, alone, individually, in smaller groups, and we cannot definitely solve conflicts unilaterally or through unilateral measures. And I think we have panelists here that have a first-hand experience about these aspects. Now, the COVID pandemic could be, I think from my point of view, a wake-up call for multilateralism. We need to redouble our efforts to rejoin resources, both intellectual and financial, and try to build on the positive examples during the pandemic. I have in mind, first of all, solidarity and responsibility. The simple gesture of different countries, the European Union being at the forefront of sharing and donating vaccines, medical equipment, and medical personnel. And this type of solidarity, I think, brings responsibility with it, and the two of them are a perfect combination to try to match the level of our ambition in general, also in addressing different conflicts. At the beginning of the crisis, there are many comments criticizing the lack of efficacy of the multilateral system, international organizations. And we all remember the early days of the pandemic, the early weeks of the pandemic, when we followed the initial instinct, which was retreating within ourselves, identifying very soon the vulnerabilities of this approach. So what happened in the meantime, we realized that we do have institutions. We have instruments to deal with that. And again, I have, not because Romania is a new member and I'm a strong believer, but I think the European Union stepped in very firmly and trying to recapture exactly this sense of multilateralism. We remember the conversations within the WHO and how we can generate joint efforts to produce a vaccine. And in an unprecedented effort, government supporting the work of scientists and researchers to try to identify what exactly could be done. So we have started already our effort to recapture the confidence in the multilateral system, and we are probably in this type of approach. I would say that it's a kind of therapy that we need to go through. In order to be successful in trying to identify the benefits of multilateralism, we have to see the flows, and there are many flows, and there continues to be flow. And from my point of view, I think when there is a will, there is a way. And I'll stop it at here for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. We will have a chance to come back. Now, Mr. Annan, I'm interested, following up on what Mr. Feruta has said, this approach to or interest in multilateralism and how to relaunch it. I mean, in dealing with the pandemic, can we transfer those lessons learned to the international arena in dealing with conflicts? And in particular, I mean, Germany has been now leading an effort on the conflict resolution in Libya. You know, Berlin 1, Berlin 2, conferences were convened. We are, in principle, the country is scheduled to head into election later this month. And so what can you tell us in terms of lessons learned about multilateral institution working with a country that has been going through, you know, a tough conflict for some time, as it transitions from a conflict phase to hopefully a post-conflict phase?
Well, thank you very much, and greetings here from Berlin to Rome and to our listeners. Thanks for having me. Look, as you all know, I guess you all know that we are in a transition phase right now. We will presumably elect a new chancellor next week. I also wanted to use that opportunity to reassure everybody who is listening in that Germany and the new government will continue its engagement to strengthen multilateralism. But to try to answer your question, looking back not only on what we did in terms of our engagement for Libya, which I'm happy to tell you some of my points of view. In a more general sense, I think Germany has probably been the country that benefited the most from a rules-based international order, both in terms of the economy, which could prosper in a predictable, stable political environment, but of course also in terms of security. And as I'm an outgoing Minister of State, I have the privilege to be, you know, very frank I can be very frank with you. During the 4 years of President Trump, I think it was like a little bit, you know, like a shock wave also for the German political establishment, because we understood that these rules-based international institutions that have created the condition or the precondition for Germany's success cannot be taken for granted. So the Alliance for Multilateralism, which my minister Heiko Maas launched a couple of years ago, and the new government and the coalition agreement committed itself to continue, was also an answer to the pressure that we saw coming from the outside on that very system. And not only from challenges of that system, which have always been there, because we all know that there are actors who are not democratically elected representatives of their countries. But all of a sudden, the challenge came from within the Western camp as well, not only the United States, but unfortunately, we also see within the European Union policies that are taking into question the separation of powers, free media and press, rule of law, etc. I think you all know what I'm talking about. So we saw ourselves somehow in a position, to work tirelessly to keep that European Union together and to defend our ideas and values, basic convictions within the European Union, but also to manage during a time where the American administration was, I would say, on another path, to bring together like-minded countries. I think we learned the lesson in a way that we need to take more care to communicate, to talk, to coordinate with our friends. And there are many out there. And it makes a difference whether or not a country like Germany, with the support of many European friends, is showing that support for multilateralism. So this is a very general remark. But what does that mean in concrete terms? And I believe Libya, Libya is maybe a case in point that some of my colleagues that I had the privilege to interact over the last roughly 4 years somehow were a little bit surprised, and quite frankly, some here in Berlin as well, to see Germany taking such a prominent role in Libya. But I think it was the Chancellor's decision, and rightful so, to identify the broader Mediterranean, Northern African region really as our neighborhood. We saw the impact of what happened in Syria, also on German domestic policies, on the stability and the political predictability. So that is something that I believe needs to continue. And I mean, it's difficult for me to judge because, my perspective is here from within. But please correct me if you don't agree, and I'm happy to have that discussion. But my impression was always that although Germany is not a neutral country, we increased our defense spending over the last 4 years. We are a predictable partner in NATO, and we will continue to be one, also with the next government. But we have been trying to develop our mediation skills. We have to try to use sometimes the historic relations with certain countries that are finding themselves in a conflict situation today, to use that, well, some may say soft power, to find political solutions and also to make a contribution in the case of Libya. And I have to say I'm very grateful that we have been able to do that with the support of also our Italian friends, if I may use that opportunity to address an audience in Rome, to strengthen a European position on Libya. And we are not there yet. We have election date. Things are still very, very difficult. But I do believe that the engagement of the Chancellor with the support of our friends and allies showed that diplomacy has a role, that we can achieve something with political instruments, and having a ceasefire in place for so many months now changed the realities in Libya. I cannot predict what is going to happen next. But my impression also from my last visit in Tripoli was, and I will conclude with that that when people enjoy the benefits of a ceasefire, if they start thinking about reinvesting in their own country, they have something to lose. They have a peace to lose. And they are exercising a kind of influence and pressure on their own politicians, which was always, the goal of the Berlin process. So I believe this offers with certain amount of optimism with regards to Libya. And I certainly hope that not only the new government here in Berlin, but also the governments like the Italian government, the French government, the United Nations that have contributed so much to this process will keep up that important work. And I close here. I hope I have not exceeded the 5 minutes too much. And thank you very much again for having me.
By a bit, it's okay. Mr. Khiari, now you're joining us from New York. In the MENA region, multilateralism has often been associated with foreign interventions that do not end well for the people on the ground. Often. Some end well, most don't. So they are not seen as a positive force for integrating politically and economically the region into rules-based global governance. So how can this perception about multilateralism in the Middle East be changed? And what role can the UN play in improving the multilateral engagement of the countries in the region, but also the perception of the people in the region about multilateral engagement?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to being with you. I would have loved to be in person, but the international situation, unfortunately, continues to hamper these in-person interactions. But we welcome the organization of the Mediterranean Dialogue to discuss the ways how to strengthen multilateralism and the new commitment to the conflict resolution in the region. And you raised the very relevant point. Just to recall that despite the what seems like growing contestation, the member states, speaking about United Nations, International Intergovernmental Organization, clearly recognizes the necessity of multilateral system based on cooperation for greater goods, in statement, not only statement, but in actions as well. And in the context of a global pandemic, which has showed the fragility and the injustice of the international system at certain level, and the existential threat that posed by a climate emergency, I think that the sheer necessity of global cooperation is underscored in stark terms. And this is what the two speakers already highlighted during their intervention. We have had the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations adopted 1 year ago. It was, in our view, an important milestone in recognizing the shared desire of member states for strengthening coordination and global governance. And the SZ Secretary General has elaborated a report, Our Common Agenda. I really encourage colleagues and the youth particularly to read it. It is a vision. It lays out a vision for building a more inclusive and networked and just multilateralism. It's not slogan words. It's really a concrete renewal of multilateralism to be much more inclusive, much more networked, and just. Yes, it means it's more developing a more even-handed approach. In the MENA region, as you have said, there are some positive trends, less positive ones, but we do believe that the multilateral cooperation is more important than ever in the current context because of the perception, as you have said, and because of the success and because of some less success story in the region. For United Nations, we have our missions in the field, along with the broader UN system, which they are doing a great job and making a difference sometimes in the field. But of course, they are not part of the headlines. These are a great manifestation of multilateralism. We don't speak aloud, but they are there. They are working in a very, very, very fragile and very dangerous environment. This is really a manifestation of our ability to come together to provide support to complex and very fragile political processes, and to help build this sustainable peace that we are looking forward, all of us. We have several situations, telegraphic, I know the constraint of time. I know on Syria you will have your special envoy, Geir Pedersen, will stress the situation in another session, but we always think, and this is his approach now, the multilateral cooperation remain crucial and essential to advance a sustainable political settlement, and he's adjusting his approach in that regard. It's very important to build confidence among stakeholders, because you made reference about the distrust perception about foreign intervention in the region. So it's important to build this confidence between the different stakeholders and mediators in the region. It's important to maintain even the fragile ceasefire that has been there. You have made, the Honorable Minister made reference to Libya, where exactly the multilateralism is ongoing. We have had the Berlin process to promote the long-term peace and stability, again through the primacy of politics, and this is a must. But the politics, of course, is going hand in hand with security, with economic and humanitarian and human right track dialogues. And this is a good example of Libya, how the globality of the problem and the globality of the solution are relevant. And we have an example, good example, because this is part of multilateralism as well, how we cooperate with regional sub-regional organizations. We have a good example of cooperation with the African Union in the context of Libya, particularly with regard to national reconciliation and cooperation. Middle East peace process, another good example, but we have, I think it's specialist, he will handle this situation, and how the importance of re-energize or reactivate the meaningful negotiation under the multilateral umbrella. Lebanon, you have an international community support. You have another example where the multilateralism has expressed its support to a country, but things are not moving in the right direction. Despite the great support of the international community of that. Anyway, just to say, in several conflicts, we have served as the main fulcrum and mediator for political processes, given our role in the United Nations as neutral intermediary. This is indispensable, and this needs to remain the case. Yeah, but
Mr. Khiari.
as you say, just the last word, last 1 point, 10 seconds. But the effectiveness of our action is sometimes limited by the political will of those with whom we engage, and this is, I think, a point that we will discuss later on in the context of the extension. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. de Mistura, you have had many experiences with various United Nations agencies in various roles in the UN system, worked in several countries, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Now, if we look at the region, there is now a conflict system from Iraq to Libya to Yemen to Syria, Lebanon increasingly, Palestine, Libya, I said, that has been now protracted for some time and is based on all the conflict dynamics in each of these situations, is likely to stay with us for some time, creating a sustained area of instability in part of the Middle East. So given your experience in many of these conflicts that we are talking about, what do you think, if there are certain lessons learned that you can share with us about how can this system be undone? How can we untangle it? And it is pretty complicated. It has local factors. I mean, Yemen is many Yemens. Libya is many Libyas when you talk about the conflict. There are regional aspects of this conflict. There are international dimensions of this conflict. So, and you have dealt with the toughest one. And so, how can multilateralism help undo this kind of situation?
Randa, this is a question for 25 minutes, of course, but I will not. So, first of all, thank you. Let me make immediately a disclaimer. As you do know, I have a new UN mission. Anything I will say has no reference to my new mission. Any of you who is being involved as a facilitator knows that in a delicate mission, you don't make comments, so silence. So that's my disclaimer. Whatever I will be saying has nothing to do with my new mission. Now, let me change then the subject, since you have been asking such a broad question, and use instead perhaps my experience, okay? So to try to prove how crucial, in spite of everything, its weaknesses, we know them all, don't we, of the multilateral system, there is really an urgent need for revitalizing it. Fly with me into a case study, okay? And you all probably know the so-called butterfly syndrome. That has been this type of idea that from one little event, you can produce a snowball in the environment of many bad events. And fly with me to Iraq, 2004, 2007. We had a major tension period at the time. I was there, I'm talking first person. And we had in the central Anbar area a major conflict. That was probably produced also because the main country involved and the coalition had decided also to fire, as you know, most of the Iraqi senior army. The tribal leaders revolted, and a man, I won't call him a gentleman, a man called Zarqawi took over with Al-Qaeda franchising. Very bad news, very tense, Fallujah, and so on. And then there was a proposal made by a person we all know, and I must say respect, David Petraeus, who had quite a creative approach, which was the Sahwa, which is, for those who don't know it, involving, engaging the local tribal population into their own interest against the excess of Zarqawi, who was even worse than Al-Qaeda at the time. The result was Zarqawi was caught, he died, and the idea was, let's continue now in engaging Sahwa. Well, here comes the butterfly flying. The authorities at the time did not. And who comes, guess what? Mr. al-Baghdadi, who then, from Mosul, declared Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, and went all the way up to Raqqa, up to the almost Turkish border in Syria. New movement of the butterfly that produced enormous tensions in terms of refugee, also temptations apart from the humanitarian crisis in Syria. And then you had attacks all over the world, from San Bernardino to St. Petersburg, from Stockholm to Australia, to Canada, to Tunis, to Istanbul, Belgium, Paris, Germany, London. So that produced a snowball effect, as was referred by our German colleague also, about changes and trauma in the European environment. You see how the butterfly has been producing a lot of waves, and that indirectly produced even, potentially, why many started doubting about the effectivity of Europe, and perhaps contributed to Brexit. One butterfly, one mistake, or one non-action. Bottom line, it would have been a lesson for all of us in the Middle East or anywhere else, a multilateral approach looking at the bigger picture, not starting with just one issue and making a possible mistake which could have been local and became global. That would be my answer through a case study why multilateralism, with all its weaknesses and fragilities, is still indispensable.
Thank you. That's a good, I mean, I have a different take on the Sahwa, but this is something that you and I can share. Okay, Mr. Koopmans, again, you are dealing with people called the mother of all conflicts. I call it the father of all conflicts. Okay, you are dealing with the father of all conflicts, you know, in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. And so we have had the Madrid conference 30 years ago. You know, we have had numerous envoys and numerous attempts at solving it. I mean, if you put yourself in a Palestinian shoe, you say to him multilateralism, he will say to you settlements. You see what I mean? So what are different ways that you are thinking about of relaunching this peace process, given this renewed interest in multilateralism?
Well, first, I'm so curious why it's for you the father and not the mother. Maybe because the father can have more children. Is that it?
No, because everything that's difficult in the Arab world is to be blamed on the woman, and we are trying to change that narrative. Because really the problems lies with the man, not with the woman.
I would think this is a problem that lies with all of us, and we need all of us to address it.
Okay.
That's also why I would say I don't share the self-doubt about multilateralism to begin with. First, multilateralism, you have it first to deal with your own problems, and I think that's evidently very successful. I mean, I am the EU special representative. The EU dealt with its own problems, and I think does overall very well. And then you have dealing with other people's problems. Now then people often say, well, multilateralism is difficult because, you know, there is division among us. But I have a colleague, the EU Special Representative for the Western Balkans. And he's been actually very successful, even though the EU itself has different opinions on, let's say, Kosovo and Serbia. He's been very successful in actually bringing multilateral solutions to that conflict. And not to speak of Staffan here, who, with all his multilateral background, can actually bring successive solutions to problems all over the world. So multilateralism, I think, is a solution, but first, it is an approach. It is an approach where you say, okay, we ourselves, I mean, I speak now for the European Union, which has, in nuances among member states, different views on the situation between Israel, the Palestinians, and Arab neighbors. But as an approach, we found within the EU fundamental unity on what we believe. We believe in a two-state solution. Jerusalem is the capital of both states. I mean, all these things. We actually are united. Then we have the approach that, okay, if we can solve our problems internally, then maybe this is something that the parties can do. What then do we propose? I think we look again at multilateralism. It is finding common interests. I mean, the European Union is an example of that, but we can also see that for the Israelis. They have the common interest of security for them, but also for the Palestinians, and the other way around, and the Arab neighbors. It is also, multilateralism is also about building institutions. And I would say that, I mean, imagine, of course it's not going to happen, but if there would be an EU version for the Middle East, you know, would that not be part of the solution itself? No, it's not going to happen, but building an institution...
I think many of us are hoping that it can happen.
It would be wonderful, and hopefully that you know, people like Staffan will step up and say, this is how we do it. But at least thinking of networks throughout the region. That in itself is not just the approach that we bring as multilateral actors, but also, I think, part of the solution. And the last thing would be, how do you build that multilateral approach? Where does it come from? It comes from looking for not just shared interests, but also shared values. And I think, okay, for the Middle Eastern region, I mean, sometimes that is a bit difficult. But I think we all agree on the need for security. We all agree on rule of law. We all agree on the need and the right for people to look for prosperity. These things are not just part of our multilateral approach, but I believe also part of the solution for the Middle East. And that's what we need to work on.
You know, except for 4 years in the life of our country in the United States, which many of us like to forget, I mean, the United States has been engaged in, and with the other members of the international community in multilateral approach to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And yet, it has not, you know, gotten, everybody agrees on the solution. Everybody knows what needs to happen to get to the solution. And yet, it's not happening. Where are the obstacles here?
I was about to agree with you, and then I don't.
Okay, perfect.
I believe the U.S. approach over the last 4 years, with whatever good things are in there, was a unilateral approach that failed. And I think by itself then...
That's why we like to forget it.
And well, I mean, I don't want to forget it because I want to learn also from mistakes.
That's a very good point.
And I believe that was a unilateral approach that failed, and it actually is an extra argument to have a multilateral approach.
Yeah.
And what hasn't been tried, at least not recently, is what I talked about. Finding the shared interest, the shared values, and also actually looking at possible shared institutions. The multilateral approach, not just in the approach, but also in the solution. It hasn't been tried under the Trump administration. I believe we all have a responsibility to see whether we can work in it now. And that's not for us, it's in the end for the parties themselves most of all.
But it has been tried before the Trump administration, right? And
I would say, I mean...
it did not work.
I'm not in the position to criticize anything in the past, but let's say looking forward, I think there is more to be gained from a more multilateral approach. The few times that we've had successes in the Middle East peace process, it was not just because the US was in the lead, but also because I think the Norwegians had some role to play, because the Madrid conference had a role to play. Correct. When there was a multilateral element in it, and it is my ambition to increase that multilateral element. Correct.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Let me go to Mr. Annan, please, and bring, you know, somehow bring your perspective on what's happening today in Vienna. There are negotiations, you know, that are taking place. Germany is part of the P4+1, you know, plus the United States. So what are Germany's expectations from this new round of talks? And based on what you know until now, where are we with this process? If you care to share with us, or you can share with us, we have been hearing about it a lot in the press, positive, negative, mostly negative. But where do you think the process is at, and where it's going next?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I can obviously not report from the meetings here, but that we have a resumption of talks is a positive development. And I will be here very cautious, because we still need to find out whether or not there's really a reason for optimism. But we are back at the negotiation table. We had a tough time behind us, because I still believe that the JCPOA, whatever you might think about details of the agreement, it's, of course, I mean, open to criticism. And we have been in very open discussions also with friends and allies, and especially with our Israeli friends, about the different aspects of the JCPOA over the last years. And by the way, we did not only during the initial negotiation shared concern about Iran's regional policies, we share that concern to this day. But we still believe that it's the only way forward, the only realistic option based on negotiated settlement to avoid Iran to become a nuclear power, which will have, as we all know, severe consequences for the entire region, and quite easily could lead to what could be a greater military conflict. But I think, to be fair, the United States left the agreement in violation of an agreement that the previous government signed, and that had consequences. But this decision by former President Trump was also used by hardliners in Tehran. And Iran is not in fulfillment of its own obligations. So I guess, what I wanted to say is, yes, we are happy that we are negotiating again, that there apparently is an option to defend the JCPOA, which was a major achievement, but we cannot afford to negotiate endlessly, because the time aspect is crucial. And we know that Iran has accumulated new know-how and knowledge, and also in a way enriched material. And that is changing the entire equation. So my hope is to come to a solution, but my expectation is also that it's rather going to be fast. And if you listen carefully to representatives of the Trump administration, I do think they share that point of view. And we have a new government in Tehran. It's not going to be easy to deal with them. But as I remain to be optimistic, there's maybe one aspect that could make things easier. We have been negotiating with a government that some called a reformist government. At least it was a more pragmatic government than the power that you will find in Iran, especially around the circles of the revolutionary leader. So now we have a hardline government. And what we experienced over so many years was that Zarif and his team always had to go back and check whether or not they had enough space to maneuver, and what they talked and negotiated with the international community really was meeting the approval of the revolutionary leader. So maybe now we are talking directly to the hardliners, and I hope that this will save us some time, but this is only my personal hope. And it's going to be difficult in Vienna, no doubt about it, but I think we all convinced that the multilateral approach is the right one. We better be successful.
Thank you. So we have 14 minutes, and I would like to put it to best use. And I have one question, which I would like you to all address it. And it has to do, what do you think are the areas, issues that can serve as leverage to enhance multilateral cooperation in the near future? Each from your perspective, vantage point, as well as conflict areas you are dealing with. So we'll start with Mr. Firuta.
Thank you. I reluctantly venture into picking up on the line from the previous speaker, from the minister. And I think it is correct, looking at the benefits of multilateralism, you have to look at the JCPOA and the process leading to the JCPOA. Having on the one hand, the European Union, the US, Russia and China, and Iran, of course, joining forces to bring about such an important instrument. The reverse of it is the unilateral action that is dismantled initially by one country and then the other country, Iran, dismantling the JCPOA. So it's another, reminder of what we can do through multilateralism. As topics, I think non-proliferation should continue to be a key topic where we should work together. It's not optional. I think it's a responsibility we all have, simply because of the non-proliferation challenges. Secondly, many countries, especially in the context of the climate change, meeting their climate change objectives, they rely on nuclear energy, which in itself brings responsibilities, and that's important. A second topic I would think we need to focus quite a lot of our attention is indeed conflict resolution. We have too many protracted conflicts, too many crises which have been long hanging in the air, and nothing has happened. There is probably, and I want to be provocative, but there is a certain fatigue at some point. I myself remember having studied some of the conflicts in university. I'm not old, I'm not that young either, but I think many generations of diplomats have went through these conflicts without any hope. And the big problem is that, and the biggest risk is that we indeed become complacent. And the key issue is that there is a fatalistic assessment that nothing can be done. But I think we do have the instruments. It's unfair, of course, to put everything on Ambassador de Mistura's and Ambassador Kubman's shoulders, but I think we all have a role to play. The other point is resilience. We cannot prepare for the future, and the societies of tomorrow and the world of tomorrow will be completely different. Probably I started to speak 2 minutes ago. In the meantime, there are 400 emails sent worldwide, 400 million emails. That means a lot because we need to prepare for what is about to come. And it's an exponential growth, and we need to prepare the population. Migration will be an important issue as well, either as a result of conflict or crisis, or as a wish to access better opportunities. Migration will be there, and we have to be prepared. And then I will end by making the point on the importance of the rule of law, human rights, and democracy. We cannot project the future and to create it for our own next generations without investing that much energy in that area.
Thank you. Mr. de Mistura, same question.
Well, having been 47 years with the UN and having seen the various cycles of multilateralism, first priority to me would be how to revitalize what is indispensable. Let's be frank, it's critical, it's being criticized, but there is no alternative. The alternative will be multilateralism, mini-multilateralism, multilateralism à la carte. They all exist at the moment, but they are not enough. COVID, just to mention one, environment, poverty, migration, and conflicts. Has anyone else solved Libya, Syria, or Yemen yet on a non-multilateral approach? Let's say unilateral one? No. So the conclusion there is we need to become creative on how to build on this. Last point, why are we in crisis? Well, because there is a polarization in the Security Council, at least as far as the Security Council is concerned. B, there is a fatigue, you're very right. There is an anesthesia, I would almost call it, among the public opinion about human rights infringements and the humanitarian tragedies. And there is a tendency of believing that you may still get what you want on a unilateral basis. And the temptation is there. And we need to help them to realize that will not produce a sustainable outcome. Now, how to do it? Probably a cocktail, a combination between multilateralism principles, which we cannot give up, and the role of women, frankly, are very important because we often forget them in that, and building on the bricks of some initiatives. I just give you one practical example. Astana. You remember, you were actually quite critical on me when I went to Astana.
I was quite what?
Critical on me.
Critical.
When I went, yes, and I recognize and I accept it and I thank you for it because it helped me to think twice, but I still decided to go. Why was the reason? Because Astana, in its own way, 3 countries who are very important but cannot solve the peace, can contribute as a brick to at least reduce the tensions. The same we heard now on Libya. 3, 4 countries being like a brick around which you need still a multilateral legitimacy. So conclusion, a cocktail between any good initiative, even of 3 or 4 well-meaning or intentionally involved countries, but not without a multilateral context.
I know we have only 8 minutes, but I cannot resist the temptation. Quickly, if you can give me a quick answer, how can you bridge Astana to the UN process?
We have bridged it.
Yeah, how did you do that?
And my successor and excellent colleague will be able to explain to you. You see, one way is, first of all, to limit the role of the Astana, for instance, context, by saying, thank you very much, you are important, you're all 3 countries essential in the conflict, and therefore you can de-escalate the conflict, but you cannot solve it. 3 countries, none of you Arab on top of it,
exactly.
You can't solve it.
Yeah.
And you can't legitimize a solution. Yeah. Only the UN. I know the UN is weak, but it has that wonderful stamp to be able to do that. Right. So a combination of the 2, you include them, you don't exclude them, you build on them,
okay.
But you don't feel threatened either and become paranoid about it.
Yeah. Same question.
3 answers, very brief. First, for the conflict I'm dealing with, the Middle East peace process, I mean, substantive multilateralism looks at I mean, finding there the things that may unite the parties. I mentioned security, but you can also mention water, energy,
Exactly.
economy, all these things you can have small bilateral deals with, but probably it's much better if you do something collective. Now, it will not be the European Community of Coal and Steel for the Middle East, but let's say that you can try. Now, on multilateralism itself, I would say let's take it seriously. And that means that if we cannot solve things unilaterally, individually, let's not have a multilateral forum where everyone then still, as Staffan also rightly says, still treats it as a unilateral thing. So where everybody gives her opinion and demands a veto right if he can't get it right. No, if you do things multilaterally, okay, then you also have to have this cooperative spirit. And I would say then let's not also treat all the posts and all the positions as little national things. Everybody needs to have their own man or woman or thing like that. And a last answer is actually the opposite. I mean, let's also be cautious with multilateralism. You just asked about the Astana process next to a UN process. I'm very much in favor of unilateralism. I think it is the answer, it's the approach, it's the solution. At the same time, if we have multilateral things everywhere, if everybody sets up their international organization for everything, that's another form of unilateralism, and it will actually take us down. So take unilateralism seriously by using it sparingly, but then put all your energy in it.
Interesting. Mr. Khiari, same question.
I think I agree with colleagues with regard to the importance of multilateralism. I think we agree that it remains the main hope to drill global challenges. And sovereign states have at their disposal an intergovernmental organization whose very purpose is to allow them to gather to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems. It's very difficult to prioritize, to speak about the conflicts. We have conflict setting situation, and we have transnational issues as well. Colleagues made reference to some of them. We do believe that the states have the footprint for a better world. I would just cite for instruments, the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, and the Paris Agreement. The difficulty now for lots of countries is that they have to. It's difficult to share to deal with the burden alone at local level, and the burden has to be shared at international level. So one of the things that we should make work better on it at international level is prevention. I know it's difficult to quantify the effect of prevention. It's not in the headlines. And I will quote Mr. Marek Golding, former Undersecretary General for the Department of Peace Affairs, the United Nations, saying that prevention cannot be filmed. It takes time and engagement. It's important that we put all our tools in the context of prevention, which remain at the core of our work. I will not add what the colleagues have said about the turbulence and uncertainty we are facing and will face in the future. But the international cooperation remains more important than ever. We have a test now at international level, in my view, Afghanistan. Multilateralism and Afghanistan is put at the test, and it's crucial that we pass the tests. Otherwise, we'll have very bad impacts on Afghanistan, on the region, and international level as well. So multilateralism should be, in our view, the matrix for international cooperation, and there is no other viable and sustainable alternative to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Annan, you have the final word.
Thank you. I just, wanted to mention an initiative that Germany put forward during our 2 years at the Security Council. And we tried to pass a resolution which establishing a connex between the security questions, stability, and climate change, the impact of climate change. Well, it was the Trump years, so they very kindly threatened to use the veto. The resolution did not pass. But I do believe, in a way, it was a successful approach because we created a group of friends. We put the topic on the agenda of the Council. And my impression right now is that in spite of all the tensions, the global tensions between the United States and China, we have unfortunately currently tensions in Europe. If you look at the situation in Belarus and the tense situation in Ukraine with the Russian Federation, but you know, we have common interests. And we need to use our instruments and our political capital, you know, not to avoid the problematic aspects of our relations. You cannot avoid them anyway, but we need to be able to cooperate. And I believe there's an interest to cooperate on the questions of climate change. It was clearly indicated also to stick with the example, by President Putin and President Xi. It will be a crucial test for the global community whether or not we are able, in spite of the tensions, to make progress in fulfilling our Paris climate goals. So climate change certainly is one aspect, and only to mention the One Health approach that really gained traction over the last years, and especially because of the pandemic. So I do see a wide range of topics that we only can, you know, address with an effective multilateralism, and that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are out of time, and I would like to thank our excellent panelists for their expertise that they were willing to share with us today. And I'm pretty sure that the audience also found the session quite interesting. So at this point, I thank you all, and it's time to move to the next session. All right. Oh.